So next we're looking at Module 6. The goal of Module 6 is to get familiarized with QueryDocumentNodeSet. QueryDocumentNodeSet is a web service within DBXL. And I want to remind you about the lab that we did previously where we queried data from a SQL database using QueryDB. So that was a part of day 2's training. And I mentioned briefly that there is a second web service called QuerySharePoint, which works in a similar fashion to QueryDB. It also interacts with Query Builder, which we talked about during the same module. So essentially you're querying the database, you're querying SharePoint, and you're bringing data into your form. The web service we're going to talk about next, QueryDocumentNodeSet, is the same general idea, except that we're going to be querying data directly from DBXL. So what do I mean by that? Let me open the DBXL administration tool. And you're going to see that DBXL itself stores XML documents. So DBXL is storing your XML forms. And what QueryDocumentNodeSet is going to do is it's a web service that's going to query the documents in the document type. So this web service doesn't look to SharePoint. It doesn't care whether you have a SharePoint mapping. It doesn't care whether you have a database mapping, whether the data is in SQL. It only cares whether the document has been submitted to DBXL. So I'm going to show you 2 uses of QueryDocumentNodeSet. And that'll get you there. Obviously there are going to be more uses, but I just want to give you a couple of options, right? 2 options so that you get some idea here of what's going on. So let me open up our form template. And this is where we left it off before, where we have a browser-enabled form. And it submits to DBXL, it maps to SharePoint, and it maps to SQL. And it makes use of the Active Directory web service to query for my user information and my manager's user information. And it uses QueryDB to query a SQL table. And we implemented cascading dropdowns using QueryDB. So here's the form. Here's my name, my email address, my manager's information. Here are the cascading dropdowns that are hooked up to QueryDB. So I'm just filling out some information here so that I can submit this form. The server's a little slow. I apologize about this. Okay, so there's my form that I have just submitted. And you'll see that there are some promoted properties here that we had promoted yesterday. Let me add a second one, and the reason I add 2 documents is when we try to generate a schema by querying this data, whether the data is in SQL or in SharePoint or via QueryDocumentNodeSet, whenever we want to query this data, InfoPath always looks for 2 items in order to correctly derive the schema. So that's what we're doing here. I'm just submitting a second item so that we have 2 forms. So So we have two forms. So now any data connections that we establish are going to connect correctly. And if I come back to DBXL, you're going to see that there are two documents available here. Great. So first thing I want to show you is called Report Builder. Report Builder is a form that was first included as a part of DBXL 2.6. It was probably around the 2.5 time that it began to get used, but really took on life on its own on 2.6, 2.7. So I need to install Report Builder. So there's a real easy way to do this. We have this tool called Forms Installer. And so we no longer have JavaScript commands that are going to install the forms. You simply take Report Builder, I can drag it around, and I'm going to drop it right on top of Form Installer. And I'm going to get prompted, do I want to install the form template Report Builder? Yes. And that failed because I had InfoPath open. So I guess that's a good point to make. InfoPath cannot be active. So let's try that again. So the template was successfully installed. So why do we need to install templates like Query Builder, Report Builder, and others? It's because these are templates that need to run full trust. They have code. So that's why that's necessary. But as you can see, it's a very simple installation. And now when you go to your InfoPath filler and you go to the installed forms section, you're going to see Report Builder is available here. And we can select fill out form. So there's Report Builder. And so the first thing we have to fill out here is our server. So that's pretty easy. It's just training.formsboard.com, and our web service name is Qdabra web service, so there's no change there. And we can click connect. And then we click Add Query. And we're going to have a button here, Create, which is going to take us to a different view. So in this view, we have to start building our query. We are first asked to select a document type. So the document type that I want to work with, that I have been working with, is called Expense Report Ernesto. I can add a description here. And then we need to determine which fields we want to retrieve from that form. So we can use the task pane for this. If we click this icon, it's going to bring up the form schema in the task pane, and we can start selecting the fields that we want to include in our query. So let's say I want the employee name, I want the manager name. Oh, well, first I need to select my base path. Sorry about that. And then I can start selecting my fields. So there's my employee name, there's my manager name, expense code, let's say purpose, and there's a total. Yep, total. And alias means it's a friendlier name. Sometimes this path isn't very easy to read, so you can give it an alias here. So let's call it employee name, manager name, expense code, purpose, and dollar total. So these are just some names for UI purposes. They don't change anything in the system. We could filter. I won't get into that because obviously I'm explaining the simplest possible scenario first, and we can sort as well. And then we can perform query. So let me perform that query and to show you what we get back. We get this table, and it's hidden by default, but you can expand it by clicking here. And you can see there's a little table here with the data. And what you can do is you can export that to Excel if you want to. So at this stage, you've generated an Excel report based on the data that's in DBXL. So we're not even concerned about the DBXL, about the database mapping. We're not concerned about the SharePoint mapping. This is straight out of DBXL. So if for some reason you cannot have a database mapping, you can use Report Builder to generate this Excel report. So if I wanted to filter, I'm going to have to submit another document. Okay, so now we have 3 documents. So now filtering becomes a little more feasible. So let me edit query. This is going to bring me back to my query page, and let me set up the filter where the expense code is equal to 23456, right? Because I entered that expense code for 2 of the reports. So now when I perform query, I'm going to have those 2 reports here, and the report is excluding the form that does not have this expense code. And again, I can export this to Excel, and I can massage this however I want. I can make it into a table, you know, whatever you want to do in Excel. So that's perhaps the most basic use of QueryDocumentNodeSet. Its interaction with Report Builder. But we're not limited to, okay, let's generate this query and export to Excel and we're done. There's a lot more behind this, and that's what the rest of this lab aims to show. You can think about what we did yesterday with the QueryDB training module. Remember that we went to Query Builder and we generated a query, and then we copied those queries and we used them in various data connections, various rules, to establish our dropdowns, our cascading dropdowns. So Report Builder is essentially going to allow us to do the same thing. The way we're going to illustrate this is by creating this example goal of let's avoid duplicates. How are we going to avoid duplicates? Well, you could argue that one way is to check the SharePoint form library. You could also argue that another way is to check the SQL database. And sure, depending on your scenario, one of those or both of those might be correct. However, I want you to think about the scenario where we have a condition in our database mapping. The condition implies that not all of the expense reports are going to be mapped to SQL. And if we have a condition in SharePoint, like we explained yesterday, then that also means that not all of the forms are mapped into SharePoint. So in that scenario where there's a condition, DBXL is the only place where all of the documents are actually stored. So DBXL holds the key to all the documents, and then based on these conditions for the SharePoint and database mapping, then DBXL pushes those out as it needs to. So the question is, we want to avoid duplicates. So let's use QueryDocumentNodeSet, because that's going to bypass any condition in the mappings, and it's also going to bypass any shredding issues. So let's say that for some reason your user entered invalid data, right? And entered a category that is too long for the data type in SQL, and the shredding fails. So this method that we're using today doesn't care about whether there's a SQL shredding failure, because it's looking at the data in DBXL. Okay. So the how does Report Builder come into this? Well, I want to take you back to the Edit Query page and show you this query. So this is an XML statement that we can use to query the web service. The way I want to choose to avoid duplicates, and this is really arbitrary, right? You could choose to avoid duplicates in other ways. The way I'm going to choose to avoid duplicate is pretty arbitrary, right? I'm going to be looking for a name, and I'm going to be looking for a date. So I'm going to only be considering those two, and when we're going to take this query and we're going to use it in the InfoPath form. So that's the goal. We have to perform some changes in the InfoPath form, though, before we can start doing that. So I want to start off on the same form that I was using yesterday. So typically the way to perform incremental form changes is to say, well, this is the form that's out there in production now, so let me save it, and this is going to become my latest form. This is going to become the form that I work off of. So I can open that in design mode, and I can start performing the changes that I want to perform. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to add a secondary data source called form options. And form options is a technique that we often use to hold fields that don't need to be preserved from one session to the next. So, for example, business purpose, it's in the main data source, because the user is going to fill this out, and the next time the form is open, you need to preserve that value. You need to have that value present. However, there are certain values that you might not need, certain temporary variables. So that's why we come up with this idea of using a form option secondary data source. So this you might not have written XML structure before, but this is pretty simple. I'm just naming this form options, and I'm creating two nodes. The first one is called isNew, and I'm giving it a default value of 0. And the second one is called exists, and I'm also giving it a value of 0. And that's it. It's pretty simple. And these are the two temporary variables that are going to determine whether we have a duplicate or not. We're going to determine whether the form is new. We're going to determine whether the form exists. Because if the form is new, if the form is not new, you're opening an existing form, then there's no need to check for duplicates. You're opening an existing form. But if the form is new, then we have to go check this next variable. So let me just save that. The use of those two variables is going to make more sense as we go along. So I'll just call that form options. And that's all I need. And I'm just going to add that as a secondary XML document. And that's it. We're done. So now we have form options, and it has those two nodes. And again, I'm adding these to the secondary data source because I don't need these the next time the form is open. Every time the form is open, these get recalculated. So I don't need to keep the values in the main data source. Okay. So we go to the form load rules. The first thing we need to think about is we need to determine whether a form is new. And if you recall, what we were doing on form load was we were filling in Active Directory data if it was blank. So if the employee name was blank, then we were filling in that employee's Active Directory data, getting the manager's data, and so on. So we already have a rule here that only operates when the form is new. So we just have to add an action here to set the value of is new. So we're just going to flip that switch from 0 to 1, right? Because the name is blank. So the only way that the name can be blank is because the form is new, because it hasn't been filled out yet. And then we're going to get into the conditional formatting for the submit button, because we want to prevent the user from submitting duplicate data. So we have to add some formatting here that is going to disable submit. But we need to think about what our condition is. And our condition is a little tricky, so let's just talk through it. We want to check whether the exists and is new parameters in that secondary data source. We only care, so let me just add those in. So we're going to check is new, and we're going to check exists. So what are we checking? We're checking whether the form is new. So if you open a blank new form and you started typing in information, so that's a new form. And then based on certain information that you type in, we're going to determine whether that form already exists. So if the form is new and it already exists, if duplicate data already exists in the system, we're going to disable that control. So we're going to prevent the user from submitting. But we want to give the user some sort of warning about this. We don't want to just give them a disabled submit button. So let's give them a calculated value, and let's just have the message, a form for this employee already exists for this report date. So this is giving you a hint of what I'm going to be looking at in my logic. I'm going to be looking for the employee submitting one report per date. Because if you have more expenses, then just include them in the existing report. So we can make this, red text. We can make it a little smaller. We can make it italic and bold. We're just giving the user some sort of visual guidance to let them know what's going on. We also need to add conditional formatting for this expression box because we don't want to show it all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to go once again to our secondary data source for form options, and we're going to look at whether the form exists. So if the form does not exist, so it's not equal to 1, we're going to hide this. So we don't want to show the message to the user. But, so we can name this rule hide message if form does not exist. But we need a second condition, and we need a second formatting parameter, and that is whether the user has opened an existing record. So let's call this hide message if this is an existing record. So if somebody's opening an existing record to modify it, you don't need to show them this message. I'm looking at the wrong thing, aren't I? Okay. Okay, so we have our skeleton in place, right? We have a message to warn the user. We're hiding that message whenever it's not needed. We have disabled the submit button when that submit button is not clickable because of the data already existing. But we still need to figure out how we're going to query for that data. So let me just save the form so I don't lose my progress, and let me call this day 3 module 6. So let's go to Report Builder, and I'm going to close Report Builder and just start out from scratch, just so it's a little clearer. Since I get to repeat the steps again, it just gives you more familiarity with Report Builder. So again, I'm going to enter my URL here. I'm going to click Connect, and then click Add Query and Create. I'm going to select the expense report from my document type dropdown, and I'm going to establish my base path, my root XPath, and then I can start selecting the columns that I want to bring into my form. So I want to bring in my employee alias, because that's one way of checking whether the user has already submitted data, employee alias. And typically, when we look at Active Directory properties, the employee alias is unique because that's your login name. So it's a little bit better than checking through email or checking through name. You might have two people with similar names, but the aliases are always going to be different. And in the example that we did earlier, we used a very simple filter, but this time we're going to use a complex filter. We're going to have two conditions. And let me just add those two items there. So it's a little bit clear here that we're doing two conditions joined by an AND. You could have two conditions joined by an OR, you could have not. So this could get more complex if we wanted to, but we just need the two conditions. And the first condition is that the employee alias, right, is equal to, let's call this is my alias, so I'll just use that as an example. And the second condition is going to be based on the report date, because as I said, we want each employee to only submit one expense report per day. So let me just go check my existing data, because my existing data is going to tell me what I have there already. So I have 3 reports. They are all submitted by my name, and they are all submitted today. So let's enter today's date. I think that's right. Yeah, year, month, date. So that's today's date. So I'm saying I'm looking for any documents that have my alias as the employee alias for this report date. And this has, filling all this out has generated an XML query. So now we're going to use this XML query. So let's copy this out just like we did with QueryDB yesterday because we want to have this available as we design the form. So we come back to the form and we're going to add our data connection. And our data connection is going to receive data from a SOAP web service, and we've entered this URL before. It's our Qdabra web service URL, and we're going back to DBXL document service. And I'll let InfoPath communicate with the server and get back a list of operations that are available. And among that list, I'm going to find QueryDocumentNodeSet. It's right at the top. Perfect. So I'll click Next, and I'm going to be asked for a query string, and I have that right here. So I can just paste it in here and click Next, and paste it again and click Next. I don't want to automatically retrieve data when the form is open because the employee name is dynamic. Depending on who the user is, the employee name, the employee alias is going to change. So I want this query to be executed after I have obtained the employer's, the employee's alias. Let me rename this though to something like check duplicates, which makes a little bit more sense than leaving the default data connection name. And I'll click Finish. So I have my data connection now. So now when the form loads, I want to fill in my Active Directory data if it's blank. And I'm getting the manager alias, the manager info, the departments, but then I want to check for duplicates. So right after the form finishes loading and finishes getting all of the Active Directory data, I'm going to go check for duplicates. The condition depends on the employee alias being filled out. So I want to keep conditioning this on employee alias is not blank, just to be safe. If the Active Directory data connection should fail for some reason, then I don't want to trigger more errors. So this is going to prevent, error after error after error. And then if we are opening an existing record, then we don't care about duplicates because if it got past the initial submission, then it's obviously not a duplicate. So let's add a second condition, and that second condition is going to check. I'm in the wrong place. I'm just going to check is new. So if the form is new, then if the form is not equal to 0 is the right condition. The form is not does not exist. Okay. So then we're going to set up our data connection. So our data connection is query check for duplicates. But just like QueryDB, before we can query using that data connection, we have to set the query dynamically. So I'm going to add set of fields value here, and I'm going to go out to the check duplicates data connection and select the query node. So through this rule, we're setting the query dynamically. And we're going to need a formula. The query that we obtained from Report Builder is this. So we have to identify that this piece right here that I have highlighted, the alias, is dynamic, right? So in its place, I need to put whatever value the form has. So let me just make a note here, say whatever value the form has for alias. And then the same thing for report date is I don't need that date hard-coded here. I need value for report date. So if I want to bring this over to insert formula, I'm going to have to do some manipulation. And the way we do that here is through insert field or group. We can replace this with the actual field for employee alias. Now the syntax here is a little off. We need to add commas to separate these, and we need to put the rest of the query around quotation marks. So it starts out with a quotation mark, and then it has alias, and then it has another quotation mark and this big long piece of text, and then another quotation mark, and then I'm going to replace my value for report date, comma, quote, and then wrap that final piece in code. And the reason I'm doing this bit by bit is because I'm going to put this all within one big concat formula. So this is one big piece of text. I'm going to dynamically get this value. I'm going to concatenate with this long piece of text, and then get that value and wrap it up. And that should be it. And of course I need to move it up because it needs to happen before the query executes. So the transformation from let me just copy that. So the transformation from this to this might take some thinking about, but I encourage you to do that because it's going to tell you a lot about how these dynamic queries work. If you want to have a basis for comparison, go back to the training lab on QueryDB and take a look at the queries that are generated by Query Builder. Some of them are generated in this way, and some of them are generated with concat already in them. So it provides a nice basis for comparison. So you can understand sort of the syntax here for the concat command and these commas and so on. So now we have this new action that takes place on load that checks for duplicates, but after we check for duplicates, we aren't really doing anything else. We need one more action here, and the action is set flags. What I mean by flags I mean these two nodes right here. So how do we know whether a document exists? We know that a document already exists, that we have duplicate data, because we're going to get some result here, and I'm actually not getting any result right now, so I need to pause and take a step back, and I need to take a look at my query and figure out what's wrong, because this isn't giving me back what I expected. See how there's no data getting returned? No data. So there's something wrong in my query, and I'm thinking maybe, yeah, that was it. So the employee alias is case sensitive. So that's pretty sneaky. So I can fix my data connection by walking through the data connection wizard one more time. I'll just modify, and I'll just get to the screens where I enter the query, and I'll just fix that up. It's pretty easy. So now when I go check duplicates data connection, I should have some result here. Yeah, here I have a result. So now I can actually use that result as part of my condition. So what do I care about? Well, I care that I checked whether DBXL has a duplicate. If DBXL gave me back a doc ID, then I have a duplicate, right? So if the doc ID is not blank, then we have a duplicate. But there's another dependency here, and the dependency is whether this is a new form. So we don't, this is conditioned on is new, and this is going to be conditioned on is new as well, because we're not going to be checking for forms that already exist. So let me go back to form options and add my condition for is new. So if it's a new, so I only want to check when it's a new form. Is new is equal to 1. If it's an existing form, then I'm just going to skip this. And all I am setting here is the value of exists. So what I'm saying is the form is new. I have checked for duplicates, and I found a doc ID. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my exists flag, and I'm just going to flip that to 1. So in other words, if a result was found, then a document for this user on this report date already exists. Boom. So we set exists equal to 1. So again, this right here, this complex filter, is pretty arbitrary of my choosing for the training purposes, right? You could check for duplicates in a different way. You know, maybe you check for duplicates by checking the expense code or by checking the start date. That's entirely up to you. The principle remains the same. The steps are pretty much the same. So if I preview this, I'm going to get that message about data already existing because I know that I have already submitted 3 forms. So see, a form for this employee already exists for this report date because I have, in fact, 3 of those for the same report date. So the form is doing its job, but we need to give some flexibility to the user, right? If they come to the form and they see this message and they see the submit button disabled, they need to have some option. And maybe the option is maybe they're in a different time zone, and maybe they are already in the next day. So maybe it's already Friday there, and they need to submit this and they can't, right? So the extra credit here is to go to the report date, and we're going to have a new rule here that whenever the value changes, we're going to clear the flag. So we're going to recheck every time that the report date changes. So that means that we have to set exists back to 0. And then we have to check for duplicates again. And I don't want to redo the entire rule, so I'm just going to go to form load and copy that rule and bring it into report date. So I just copied the rule and pasted it back in here. And I don't need these conditions because if the value of the report date changes, then I definitely want to recheck this. You know, if the user's making changes to the form, then I definitely want to check. And then my set flag rule, I'm also going to need that, so I'll just copy it over. So it's pretty much the same rule. I'm just placing it in a different location so that when I load the form, I'm going to get this message that says you have already submitted a report on this date, so you can't submit. So let me just change this to the 25th. And the message is gone and my submit button is enabled. So that's the purpose here. The purpose is to, number one, to ensure that your data meets whatever process your company has, right? So if the process is that this employee, each employee can only submit 1 expense report per date, then we're enforcing that policy through the form rules. Not only that, but you're making it a little easier on all the parties involved, because if your form allowed the submission, somebody's going to have to catch that. Somebody's going to have to communicate to the user, maybe delete the form, tell them to re-enter the data, or tell them to modify the data. So it just becomes more of a hassle for the user experience for the process in your company. So you give them that information up front, right? You can't submit this form. You know, you already have a report on this date. And if they change the date, then that's fine because they're no longer violating the company policy. So that wraps it up for Module 6 of Qdabra's DBXL training.